Welcome to California in Focus. I'm David Mastio, and today we're talking about housing. Again. Joining me today is the Center Square's Kenneth Schrupp, California reporter. Kenneth, thanks for joining us today, and tell me what's the latest news on housing in California.
Hey, David. Governor Newsom signed a new executive order demanding that the state look into how it can really streamline housing development and even how the state can use federal climate change funding towards housing as a climate mitigation, carbon reduction element. Housing experts say that if government decides to act on a lot of Newsom's recommendations, such as changing the building code, making it easier to build infill housing more quickly. Infill housing is putting in a new building where there already has been a building or development, that we can really reduce costs of building housing by about 10 to 30%. Now, this is important because most of California's very high cost of living is from its high cost of real estate. California has about a 4.5 million unit housing shortage. California is aiming to zone 2.5 million more homes by 2030. But it doesn't really matter if you zone these new homes if they just don't get built because it's too expensive because of development costs that also include labor costs, which is, again, a product of also housing costs because people who work need to live somewhere. So we're in a bit of a chicken and egg situation where really to get the economy moving again here in the state, we need to significantly increase the housing supply. Newsom's order doesn't really mandate any specific change, but asks the state government, the state building code, the labor and housing development organizations that determine whether or not prevailing wages will have to be used to try to just reduce the cost of housing and prioritize that over other considerations.
Calling an executive order seems kind of generous for a document that seems to be mostly making recommendations to other people that the governor doesn't necessarily have power over. It's more of an executive agenda.
Yeah, I think that's an accurate characterization of what this is. I think we've seen Newsom come out and say, look, we're going to start building housing. Here's an executive order demanding that we build more housing. Well, he can't really do that. He doesn't really have a lot of oversight over that. Just the day before, perhaps to preempt the governor, the California State Superintendent, Tony Thurmond, announced that he wants to help build 2.3 million of those 2.5 million homes on extra land on schools. But again, this is kind of more of a suggestion because it's not like he can directly order that housing be built on the schools. It's more of like an agenda that schools can use extra land to build housing, which is already allowed under another law. So it's not like Thurmond was actually announcing anything new. And similarly, Newsom isn't really announcing any change other than, well, he wants California to use federal climate change funding to build housing. He wants California regulatory agencies to make housing easier to build.
Does Newsom know whether the feds are going to go along with this idea of using federal climate change money for housing initiatives?
I think, honestly, this is an easier sell than electric vehicles, right? The argument he makes is if you build housing closer to where people work, they drive less and they can walk to more places too if it's in a more dense urban environment. And that, building housing in California is extremely poorly managed forest. He blames climate change, but the evidence does suggest poor forest management is driving California's wildfires. Until those are under control, it is difficult to keep extending our cities outward. So there are arguments to be made that, yes, building housing where it is high demand, where people will have to drive less, will actually reduce emissions and driving more so than other climate initiatives that the state is spending billions of dollars on will.
So California as a whole, one of the things that's driving the governor, California is not getting any faster at building housing, is it?
No, not really. And, there are a lot of people who are like, oh, well, you got to blame interest rates for California's housing production slowdown. Well, interest rates affect everywhere in the country, right? It's not a state by state interest rate, really. And Dallas alone permitted more housing than all of California in April, I believe. The fact that one city can permit more housing than the whole state, the largest state in the union, is really more telling about California than it is about Dallas. And if we're looking at data that was released in April, housing permitting collapsed 45% from 2022 to 2023. So again, I mean, housing experts say that rising interest rates did reduce California housing a lot. So if you have a more perilous housing production business situation in California, your costs going up just a little bit can mean the difference between maybe making a little profit to being very much underwater.
Kenneth, thanks for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.